A long time ago, in a land that imagination forgot, a land shrouded in mist, there lived a person, a young man, who tended to isolate himself. He was a loner. And one of the reasons he was a loner is because he was the result of a union of fairy and human. So his father was fairy and his mother was human. And he noticed that, his voice was different. He didn't speak like regular humans. And that was partly because of the fairy blood and because of the union of the two. But he also found that words weren't always necessary in order to communicate what he wanted to communicate. And he found that in order to be more clear on what he wanted to communicate to people when he was with people, when he chose to be with people, it was much easier for him to formulate those thoughts and to express those because it took a lot of effort for him to actually vocalize. And so he would choose that time to pause, that time, that solitary time, that time of being a hermit, to actually formulate the thoughts and the things that he wanted to say. So when he did re-enter Lemurian villages, he would have something of substance to say. To him, it was, what was the point of speaking if his words didn't carry weight, if they didn't have the substance of soul? So he preferred to be quiet, and he preferred to observe when he was with others. But his primary preference was to actually be alone. So he spent a lot of time in nature, and he spent a lot of time wandering. And one particular time before he left, his grandmother, his human grandmother, gave him a crystal. Now, when he looked at the crystal, it didn't look like it was anything special. It looked like it actually had gone through a lot. And he thought, well, his grandmother doesn't do anything without a purpose, so she must have felt that this crystal, even though he looked at it and he thought, why would she give this to me, that there was some sort of bigger picture, some deeper meaning to it. So he received it, and he thanked his grandmother with no words, just with his heart, his energy, and his love, and his arms holding her close. And that was enough. And off he went on his journey. Now, his journey lasted several days from the interior of Lemuria to the mountain lands. this particular area of the mountainlands was very isolated, and it was one of the reasons why he was drawn to it. It was colder, it was much more rugged, and much more challenging of a terrain for him. But still he pressed on. He wandered through the mountains. He would stop to nourish himself by the stream or to rest for a while before he pressed on and climbed a particular peak. When he got about halfway up the peak, he stopped and he really listened. Now, it's one thing to listen with your ears, it's another thing to listen with your heart, and more still to listen with your soul. And so it was that he dropped in from hearing what was around him, the birds chirping, a waterfall, the wind whispering through the trees, a scurry or a scamper of a critter. And then dropping into his heart, he felt the love that he felt for his time of solitude. He felt all the appreciation and the thankfulness for the beauty and for this time to be with himself and with his higher self and soul. And then he dropped further, deeper into his soul, and he felt her presence. Now here is a place that he was very comfortable because there weren't any words needed. He could just surrender to the embrace of his soul. And in this place, he started to become aware of more of his unfamiliar senses, which was perhaps more natural for him than most humans because it was influenced by his fairy genetics. And he knew from his relationship with his father that fairy was quite comfortable with the unfamiliar senses. And so, surrendering to his soul, he felt the warmth of this place that he was sitting in the middle of the mountain, near the waterfall, experiencing the light and the shadow and the breeze. He felt the light and life of this place. He felt the movement. And he really listened for the voice that speaks without words. He felt the substance, the soul of this sacred place. And suddenly he felt his heart and his mind move, and he started to weep. In his hand, of course, was the crystal. And without him even being aware of it at first, he realized in that moment that the crystal had been helping him all along, helping him to connect to soul, helping him to sit and be in a place of solitude, helping him to feel the gratitude, the joy, and the wonder, and helping him to make space for his unfamiliar senses. As he wiped his tears, he looked at the crystal anew, and he realized that some of the cracks and crevices that it held or expressed, some of the imperfections of the way it leaned because it was self-healed, and part of it was no longer there. He realized in those quirks or imperfections, that the crystal had a certain beauty to it. And it made him ponder how really humans were like that too, and actually fairy as well. And it made him ponder about when there was an offspring like himself that was a result of a sacred union between fairy and human. That there were gifts, to be sure, but they were also unusual quirks and imperfections. He also realized that maybe that was one of the reasons why he preferred his own company to the company of others. Well, with those realizations, he touched the crystal to his heart, and he filled it with his love and appreciation. He touched it to his mind, and he allowed for a mind meld. Again, a union, a communion, even a communication without words. He felt himself shift again, and he felt the joy well up in his heart. As he looked at the crystal one more time, he saw rainbows, new ones, and some message plates that weren't there before. They were communicating. And that in itself was something to feel grateful for. When he was done and ready and complete for the day, he allowed himself to have a little bit to eat, nourish himself with a little bit of the water, and then he went to sleep. Now, that night, in his dreams, maybe because he had made time for solitude and he had made time to commune with the crystal and with his soul, maybe it was also because he was in the sacred place in nature. But a fairy queen came to him through his dreams. And she spoke in sound, not with words. They were more higher pitched sounds, more like there seemed to be more of a dissonance happening, until eventually there was a resonance. And on that note, he awoke to the first rays of the sun. And there she was, standing, the fairy queen. She offered him his hand, and the two of them walked together a while. They spoke very little. They said so much more without words. But he remembered her. She was his fairy godmother, so to speak, was there when he was born, and had been watching over him ever since. He could be moved to tears in an instant in her presence. Her nature was so soulful. There was a purity to her that when he didn't want to see the truth by being in her presence, he was always faced with it. It was almost as though her energy was a mirror and a catalyst for bringing things up. And he realized, as they sat together and they walked together, that part of the reason that he preferred his solitude was because he was afraid of the judgments of both the human community and the fairy community, regardless of where he went to be with people, because he was different. And it was through being with his fairy godmother, that he saw that maybe there was a new possibility, a new way for him to think about that, so that perhaps others could receive him more easily, and that maybe he could let one or two of them in to his heart. Yes, he thought, there is value in solitude, and value to being alone, and value to his adventures, his journeys into the unknown. But he realized it needed to be balanced with being able to also connect with certain people, either fairy or human, of his choice. And that, of course, he had a choice. If the energy didn't feel right, he could back away. And if it was someplace he wanted to spend his time, he could move through the uncomfortability, and he could always call on his fairy godmother. Her presence would be there, if not in physical form, in energy. He gave the crystal to this fairy queen, and she held it close to her heart. And once again, she sang, and this time she sang into the crystal. Hey, hi-yo. Hey, hi-yo. Hey, hi-yo. Hey-yo. The two embraced. He thanked his fairy godmother. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, she was gone, and this time the crystal was back in his hands. He looked at this crystal now with new eyes, with its imperfections and its differences, and also its balance and harmony. He took his time going back to his mother in the human realm, back to the village. And when he returned, again, there was a village council where people would get together and they would share their concerns of what was going on in the village, and people would help one another, and it was also a time to feast together and to enjoy one another's company. And so when the time for speaking was done, it was time to just socialize for a while when the issues had been dealt with. His mother expected that he would leave, but he didn't. And he looked around the group until he spotted someone across the fire. It was a young man, a little younger than him. His eyes were very, very green. And there was something that felt very comforting to this fairy human with the crystal. And he walked over, he introduced himself, and the two just sat together for a while. In time, as the sun began to set, they began to share a little. And the fairy human gave this younger man with the green eyes the crystal to hold. And the two began to smile and laugh, and something started to open. That night, when the fairy human was going to sleep in his mother's house, he reflected on the evening. He reflected on his time in the mountains and his time with the fairy queen, and on the new crystal. And he realized that the change and changes in him and that opportunity to meet the new young friend wouldn't have happened had he not gone to the mountains to have that solitude time and to open himself up to the unfamiliar and the unknown. For somewhere in there, the change had happened. Somewhere in there, magic had occurred. He felt his heart well up with joy, love, gratitude. And when he went to sleep, this time, he felt a peace he had not felt before. At peace more with who he was. So when he knew when the next morning would start, it would be a new beginning. And that, my friend, is the end of the story. Ooh-ah-woo, hey, 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 hi-yo, hey, yo, ooh-ah-woo, ooh-ah-woo, hey, hi-yo, hi.